Sarah Martinez had been working at Davidson's gun shop for 3 years when everything changed on that rainy Tuesday morning. The bell above the door chimed as she looked up from cleaning the display case, watching a woman in her mid-30s enter. The stranger wore simple jeans and a worn leather jacket, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested trouble, but Sarah's manager, Chuck Davidson, immediately tensed behind the counter. The woman approached the counter with quiet confidence, her movements precise and controlled. When she spoke, her voice was steady and professional. She explained that she needed to purchase a specific rifle for hunting purposes, providing all the necessary documentation. Sarah began processing the paperwork, noting how the woman's identification showed an address in Colorado and her hunting license was current. Chuck stepped forward abruptly, his face flushed red with irritation. He had been increasingly difficult to work with lately, making snap judgments about customers based on his personal biases rather than following proper procedures. Without even reviewing the woman's paperwork properly, he declared that something didn't feel right about the transaction. His voice grew louder as he insisted that the woman looked suspicious and that he wouldn't sell firearms to someone who seemed like trouble. The woman remained remarkably calm throughout Chuck's outburst, simply asking what specific concerns he had about her documentation. Every paper she had provided was legitimate and in order. Her background check would clear without any issues, and she had provided valid identification and proper licensing. Sarah tried to intervene, pointing out that everything appeared to be completely legal and above board. But Chuck was already making his decision. With unnecessary drama, Chuck announced that he was refusing the sale and asked the woman to leave his store immediately. He claimed it was his right as a business owner to refuse service to anyone, though his reasoning made no legal sense. The woman didn't argue or cause a scene. Instead, she quietly gathered her paperwork, thanked Sarah for her professionalism, and headed toward the door. As she reached the exit, the woman paused and turned back briefly. Her eyes met Chuck's, and for just a moment, Sarah noticed something in her expression that seemed both disappointed and knowing. The woman simply nodded once and walked out into the rain, disappearing down the street. Chuck muttered something about trusting his instincts and went back to his office, leaving Sarah to wonder what had just happened and why her boss had acted so unreasonably toward what seemed like a perfectly legitimate customer. 45 minutes after the woman left, Sarah was still troubled by the encounter. She couldn't shake the feeling that Chuck had made a terrible mistake. The woman had been polite, professional, and completely prepared with all the correct documentation. Sarah had processed hundreds of firearm sales, and this had been one of the most straightforward transactions she had encountered, until Chuck's intervention. The shop's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah answered to find a gruff male voice asking to speak with the manager about a recent customer interaction. Chuck emerged from his office with an annoyed expression, clearly irritated by what he assumed was a complaint call. He took the phone with an air of defiance, ready to defend his decision to refuse the sale. The conversation that followed was brief, but intense. Sarah watched Chuck's face change from arrogance to confusion, then to something approaching panic. His voice became smaller and more defensive as he tried to explain his actions. The caller seemed to be asking specific questions about why the sale had been refused, and Chuck's answers grew increasingly weak and uncertain. After hanging up, Chuck stood silently for several minutes, staring at the phone as if it might ring again. When Sarah asked what the call had been about, he mumbled something about a misunderstanding and retreated to his office. The change in his demeanor was dramatic. The confident, stubborn man who had thrown a customer out of his store was now clearly shaken by whatever he had heard on that phone call. Sarah continued working, but the atmosphere in the shop had shifted completely. Chuck kept emerging from his office to look out the front windows as if expecting something. He made several phone calls, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Each conversation seemed to make him more nervous rather than less. When regular customers came in during the afternoon, Chuck was distracted and jumpy, completely unlike his usual overbearing self. As closing time approached, Sarah noticed a black sedan parked across the street. The vehicle had been there for about 20 minutes, and while she couldn't see inside due to tinted windows, something about its presence felt significant. Chuck had noticed it too and was now pacing behind the counter, checking his watch repeatedly and muttering under his breath about making mistakes and not thinking clearly about the morning's events. At exactly 6 o'clock, as Sarah was preparing to lock up the shop, 3 black SUVs pulled up in front of Davidson's gun shop. The vehicles moved with military precision, and men in tactical gear began emerging from each one. Sarah's heart raced as she realized these weren't ordinary law enforcement officers. Their equipment, movements, and coordinated approach suggested something far more serious than a routine investigation. The lead figure approached the shop's front door and knocked firmly but politely. Sarah looked to Chuck, who had gone completely pale and was gripping the counter for support. With shaking hands, he unlocked the door to face whatever was coming. The man who entered was tall and professional, wearing tactical gear that clearly marked him as military special operations. His bearing and the way he carried himself left no doubt about his training and experience. Behind him, Sarah could see other team members taking positions around the shop, not threateningly, but with the systematic thoroughness of professionals securing an area. The lead operator introduced himself simply as Commander Hayes and asked to speak with Chuck Davidson about the incident that morning. His tone was respectful but carried an unmistakable authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. Chuck stammered through an explanation of his decision to refuse the sale, trying to justify his actions by claiming he had suspected something was wrong. Commander Hayes listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes in a small notebook. When Chuck finished his explanation, the commander asked several specific questions about what exactly had seemed suspicious about the woman's behavior or documentation. Unable to provide any concrete reasons beyond his vague feelings, Chuck's explanation fell apart under careful questioning. Commander Hayes then asked to see the paperwork the woman had attempted to submit and reviewed each document with professional attention to detail. Every piece of identification, every license, every form had been completely legitimate and properly completed. After completing his review, Commander Hayes closed the folder and looked directly at Chuck. What he said next changed everything Sarah thought she knew about the morning's events. The woman Chuck had refused to serve was Lieutenant Commander Elena Rodriguez, a decorated Navy SEAL who had recently returned from an overseas deployment. She had been in town visiting family and had stopped to purchase a hunting rifle for a recreational trip that was part of her leave time. Commander Hayes continued his explanation, revealing details that made Chuck's face grow even paler. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez had served 3 combat deployments in the Middle East and had been decorated for valor twice. She was currently on leave before taking up a new assignment training other special operations personnel. Her visit to Davidson's gun shop had been routine, simply wanting to purchase equipment for recreational hunting during her time off. The commander explained that what made Chuck's behavior particularly problematic was that it had occurred just hours before. Rodriguez was scheduled to meet with a group of young veterans who were struggling with their transition back to civilian life. She volunteered with a local organization that helped former service members adjust to life after military service. And today's meeting was especially important because several of the veterans were considering whether to continue with the program. When Rodriguez had called her commanding officer to report the discriminatory treatment she had experienced, it had triggered an immediate response. The military takes very seriously any situation where their personnel face unfair treatment, especially when it might be based on gender bias or other discriminatory factors. A formal investigation had been launched within hours of Rodriguez's report. Sarah listened in growing amazement as Commander Hayes described Rodriguez's military record. The woman Chuck had dismissed as suspicious had led rescue operations behind enemy lines, had been responsible for saving dozens of civilian lives during humanitarian missions, and had earned the respect of her peers through years of exemplary service. Her current assignment involved training other soldiers in advanced tactical operations. The commander's tone remained professional, but his message was clear. Chuck's refusal to serve Rodriguez had not only been wrong from a business standpoint, but it had also been deeply disrespectful to someone who had sacrificed years of her life serving her country. The military community was tight-knit, and word of such treatment spread quickly among active and retired service members. Chuck tried to defend himself by claiming he couldn't have known about Rodriguez's military service, but Commander Hayes pointed out that discrimination is wrong regardless of someone's background. The woman had presented legitimate identification and proper documentation, and there had been no legal reason to refuse the sale. Chuck's actions had been based entirely on his own biased assumptions rather than any factual concerns about the transaction. Commander Hayes informed Chuck that the incident was now part of an official military investigation into discrimination against service members. The investigation would examine not only what had happened that morning, but also whether Davidson's gun shop had a pattern of treating military personnel unfairly. The military maintained detailed records of where their personnel encountered problems in civilian businesses, and these records could affect everything, from security clearances to official recommendations. The broader implications became clear as Commander Hayes explained that Davidson's gun shop had previously been recommended by local military personnel as a reliable place for service members to conduct business. Rodriguez herself had been referred to the shop by another veteran who had spoken highly of their previous experiences there. Chuck's actions had not only damaged one person's day, but had potentially ruined years of positive relationships between the shop and the military community. Sarah realized that the military customers she had served over the years represented a significant portion of their business. Service members and veterans often purchased firearms for sport, hunting, and collection purposes, and they frequently recommended businesses to their fellow service members. Losing the trust and respect of this community could have serious financial consequences. For the shop, the commander also revealed that Rodriguez's story had already begun spreading through military social networks and veteran organizations. In the modern age of social media and instant communication, news of discriminatory treatment travels fast within communities. Several military blogs and veteran support groups were already discussing the incident, and the shop's reputation within these circles was rapidly deteriorating. Chuck's attempts to minimize the situation were met with firm but professional responses from Commander Hayes. This wasn't just about one transaction or one upset customer. It was about respect, dignity, and the way society treats those who have served their country. The military's investigation would be thorough and would include interviews with other customers and staff members to determine whether similar incidents had occurred before. As the full scope of the situation became apparent, Chuck began to understand that his split-second decision that morning was going to have consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. What he had thought was simply exercising his right as a business owner had instead created a serious situation that now involved military investigators, community relations, and his shop's entire future relationship with local service members. Commander Hayes concluded his visit by informing Chuck that he would be expected to cooperate fully with the military's investigation, which would include providing documentation of the shop's sales policies and any training materials given to staff about customer service and non-discrimination practices. The investigation would also examine whether Chuck's actions violated any federal laws regarding discrimination in places of public accommodation. In the days that followed, the consequences of Chuck's decision became increasingly apparent. Word spread quickly through the local veteran community, and several military customers who had been regular visitors to the shop began taking their business elsewhere. Online reviews began appearing that detailed not only the Rodriguez incident but also questioned whether the shop could be trusted to treat all customers fairly and professionally. Sarah found herself fielding phone calls from concerned customers, many of whom were veterans or active military personnel, asking whether the stories they had heard were true. She tried to handle each call professionally, but it became clear that the shop's reputation had been severely damaged. Some customers expressed disappointment not just in Chuck's actions, but in the fact that it had taken a military investigation to bring attention to what they saw as a broader problem with customer treatment. The local newspaper picked up the story after a veteran advocacy group issued a statement about discrimination against service members in civilian businesses. The article detailed Rodriguez's impressive military record and contrasted it with the treatment she had received at Davidson's gun shop. The story generated significant discussion in the community about how veterans and active military personnel should be treated by local businesses. Chuck was forced to attend several meetings with military officials and community leaders to address the situation. He issued a public apology and announced new training procedures for all staff members to prevent similar incidents in the future. However, the damage to the shop's reputation proved difficult to repair, and several longtime military customers indicated they would continue shopping. elsewhere until they were confident that real changes had been made. The incident became a learning experience for the entire community about the importance of treating all customers with respect and dignity, regardless of their appearance or the assumptions people might make about them. Sarah often reflected on how different things might have been if Chuck had simply processed the sale normally, treating Rodriguez like any other qualified customer. One moment of poor judgment had created consequences that affected not just Chuck and his business, but also damaged relationships between the shop and the military community that had taken years to build.